A cold January day covered France with a gray sky, and it seemed that nature itself pressed heavily on the
Command, this is Naval
exhausted
Company.
men.
We're under heavy attack.
Snow
Enemy
lay
tanks
in
and infantry
uneven
advancing on our
layers,
position.
torn by
Requesting
tank
immediate
tracks
artillery
and
support on
soldier
these
boots.
coordinates.
The ground was frozen so hard that any touch of it echoed with the sound of metal striking stone. In the Colmar pocket, it was cold, hungry, and frightening. Yet here the fate of the war in Europe was being decided. Dear friends, before we go deeper into this story, write in the comments which city and country you're joining us from. Do not forget to like and subscribe, because ahead lies something that will shake you to the core. The 3rd Infantry Division of the United States stood worn down. Months of relentless battles had drained every bit of strength from the men. Company B of the 15th Regiment looked like a shadow of itself. At the start of the campaign, it had more than 120 men. Now, barely a third remained who could still hold a weapon. Their faces were gaunt, their cheeks hollow, their eyes darkened with chronic exhaustion. They knew another fight was coming, and they knew the enemy had no intention of giving up. Audie Murphy, a short boy from Texas, whom fate had placed in command, looked at his men and understood that if he faltered now, the company would collapse. He was a first lieutenant, but he looked almost like a teenager. Still, it was he who carried the burden of holding a section of the front where the outcome of the offensive would be decided. In the Colmar pocket, the Germans clung to every yard of ground. For them, it was the last chance to keep a bridgehead west of the Rhine. For the Americans, it was the mission to drive the enemy out and clear the path to final victory. The Holtzwihr forest, dark, dense, blanketed in snow, stood like a sentinel over the road leading deeper into France. Whoever held that forest controlled the whole region. Lieutenant Colonel Keith Ware would later say that control of the forest was more important than any other position, and he was right. Company B received the order to move forward. Snow crunched underfoot, breath turned into mist. The soldiers carried everything on their backs: weapons, gear, ammunition. Each man bore weeks of fear, fatigue, and cold. They tried not to think about what awaited them, but each one understood that without that forest, there would be no victory. The Americans knew they were facing not just ordinary units, but hardened mountain troops. These soldiers, transferred from Norway, knew how to fight in mountains, in forests, in snow. They were experienced, disciplined, and confident in their superiority. Audie Murphy understood that his company had little chance, but the order was clear. The night was long. Soldiers tried to dig trenches, but the frozen ground refused to yield. The sound of picks and shovels cut through the silence like hammer strokes on an anvil. The men worked more to keep warm than to gain results. Every step brought pain through their bodies. Fingers stiffened, boots soaked through, and the cold began to rot their feet. Murphy walked along the positions, encouraging his men. He spoke quietly but firmly. His voice was an anchor for the others. They looked at him and knew they must not give up. Inside, his heart pounded, but outwardly he was calm. The snow thickened, branches bent under its heavy weight. With each minute, the darkness deepened. Soldiers pressed closer to one another for warmth. Some pulled family photographs from pockets, some whispered prayers. In those moments, each man was alone with his fear. Murphy thought of Texas, of his farm, of his home, his mother, his brothers and sisters. These memories warmed him, but instantly pulled him back into the harsh reality. He was no longer a farm boy, but a commander, with the fate of his men on his shoulders. With dawn came unease. Everyone knew that morning was often the time chosen for attack. Every sound felt like the omen of death. Men trembled not only from the cold but also from tension. Yet the attack did not come. Instead, 2 American tank destroyers rolled up to help and took positions. It lifted the spirits of the soldiers. They felt they were not alone, that there was strength behind them. But Audie Murphy was not deceived. He knew this was only a pause. The real battle was still ahead, and this pause would cost dearly. Dear listeners, this is how the story of a deed begins, a deed that entered history books, a deed carried out by a simple boy from Texas whose name the world now remembers. In the next chapter, we will go deeper into the Holtzwihr forest and witness how silence gives birth to a storm. The forest of Holtzwihr did not look like a battlefield at first sight. To anyone who had not yet tasted the war, it would have appeared simply as a winter landscape, white branches, heavy snow, dark trunks reaching skyward. The silence of January spread across the land. But to the men of the 3rd Infantry Division, it was not a place of beauty. It was a graveyard waiting to be filled. Behind every tree might be an enemy. Behind every rise of frozen ground might lurk a machine gun, and beyond every bend of the narrow road might roll out the steel monsters of the German army. This stretch of woodland held meaning far beyond its physical size. It commanded the approaches to the fortified village of Holtzwihr. Whoever possessed it could look down upon the enemy and shape the course of the campaign. Lieutenant Colonel Keith Ware would later explain that possession of the forest was of supreme importance because its height and its cover allowed domination over the German stronghold. Without control of Holtzwihr, the Americans could not advance, and without advance, there would be no collapse of the Colmar pocket. On the morning of the 23rd of January, the 30th Infantry Regiment received the order to attack. The men moved forward into the forest with the kind of silence that belongs not to triumph, but to dread. They were weary after long weeks of fighting, cold from endless hours in snow, and thin from rations that never seemed enough. Yet they obeyed. Boots crunched on the ice, rifles were clutched close, eyes scanned the dim tree line. Somewhere out there were Germans waiting, and the Americans knew that the encounter would not be merciful. The first signs of resistance came quickly. Mortar shells fell with a scream and burst among the leading companies, flinging shards of metal into bark and flesh. Trees splintered, branches crashed to the ground, snow cascaded in choking waves over men who already struggled to breathe in the freezing air. Still they pushed forward. Officers shouted encouragement. Sergeants urged their squads onward. They had been told to seize the forest, and the cost had not been measured. Then came the sound of engines, deep and resonant, growing louder with every heartbeat. Through the trees appeared the hulking silhouettes of German armored vehicles. 10 machines, tanks, and self-propelled guns rolled into view. Their steel bodies seemed invincible. Their tracks chewed the snow with relentless hunger. Behind them advanced more than 100 infantrymen, dressed in white camouflage that made them nearly invisible against the frozen landscape. Only the dark slits of their helmets and the black muzzles of their rifles betrayed their presence. The battle that followed was chaos. The Americans fired with rifles and machine guns, but the bullets seemed to vanish into the white air. Bazooka teams tried to aim at the approaching tanks, but the weapons misfired or their rockets bounced off thick armor. The artillery called from behind the lines sent shells that exploded with thunder, but the German formation pressed on. Every step the enemy took forward pushed the 30th Regiment closer to collapse. The men had no real protection. The ground was too hard to dig trenches. Every attempt to carve out shelter ended with the clang of metal against unyielding frost. Soldiers lay behind fallen logs, pressed themselves against icy ridges, or simply threw their bodies flat in the snow, hoping the enemy fire would pass over them. It did not. Shells burst, throwing men into the air. Machine gun bullets cut across the field like scythes. The white forest was stained red, and the snow absorbed the color in silence. By afternoon, the 30th Regiment was breaking apart. Communications failed. Companies became scattered. Squads lost sight of each other. Commanders tried to rally men who no longer knew where the line was supposed to stand. The forest that had seemed silent and lifeless in the morning was now alive with shrieks, explosions, and the grinding of tank engines. Smoke covered the trees, and in that haze, soldiers stumbled blindly, firing at shadows. When night fell, the retreat was unavoidable. The regiment was shattered. Groups of survivors struggled back through the trees, dragging the wounded on improvised sleds made from branches or carrying them in firemen lifts until their own strength gave out. Some left comrades lying in the snow with whispered prayers, because to carry them meant death for both. The cold seized the bodies of the fallen, turning them rigid before the morning. Weapons were abandoned, helmets lost, the ground marked with trails of blood that froze into dark streaks on the white surface. The 30th Regiment had been reduced to fragments. Once it had marched into the forest with full strength, but by the end of that day it was broken under strength and disorganized, forced to fall back from the very place it had been ordered to capture. The Germans had reason to be proud. They had halted an American regiment and inflicted a heavy blow, but they knew the battle was far from finished. The Americans would return, for the forest of Holtzwihr was too important to leave in enemy hands. And so the German troops prepared to hold again. They reinforced their positions, concealed machine guns, and waited with cold patience for the next assault. The white camouflage they wore blended perfectly with the landscape, and their morale was strengthened by the knowledge that they had turned back one of the strongest regiments in the division. Snow fell again that night, covering the wreckage, softening the outlines of the bodies, blanketing the scars of battle in silence. But beneath that silence lay the truth. The Americans had been bloodied, but not defeated. Another regiment would come. Orders would be given again. The price would rise, but the mission would not change. For the 15th Regiment, the burden would be greater. They had seen the survivors of the 30th. They had heard their broken voices, had watched them stumble into camp with hollow eyes and shaking hands. They had counted the gaps in their ranks and understood the cost. Yet they too would be sent forward. Among them was Company B, already reduced in number, already weakened by previous battles. These men would be asked to go into the same forest, against the same enemy, under the same conditions of cold and exhaustion. The forest of Holtzwihr was no longer merely a place on a map. It was a trial, a crucible, a measure of endurance and sacrifice. Every man who entered it carried on his shoulders not only his rifle, but the weight of destiny. Some would not return. Others would come back scarred forever. And a few would find themselves in moments that defined history, moments when the choice was simple but terrible to stand and fight or to perish with the rest. Dear listeners, the fall of the 30th Regiment was only the beginning. The forest of Riedweiler had tasted blood, and it would demand more. In the next chapter, we will follow Company B as it enters this frozen arena, already weary, already wounded, yet still determined to hold where others had fallen. Night fell upon the forest of Riedweiler with a heaviness that seemed almost unbearable. The sky turned a deep iron gray, the clouds hung low, and the air cut into the lungs with every breath. The men of Company B, 15th Infantry Regiment, advanced slowly through the snow, their boots sinking into the frozen crust with each weary step. They were no longer fresh troops. They were men who had already seen too much, who carried on their shoulders not only rifles and packs, but also the weight of weeks of exhaustion and fear. They moved like shadows, silent and bent under the burden of their gear. The snow creaked beneath them, and the wind whistled through the branches, masking their progress. Ahead lay the southern edge of the forest, the very place where the 30th Regiment had bled and broken only a day before. Every soldier of Company B knew the story. They had heard how their comrades had been driven back by steel and fire, how men had vanished into smoke and snow, and still they were ordered forward. When they reached their assigned position, there was no relief, no shelter, no rest. The ground was hard as iron. Picks and shovels rang out against it with a hollow metallic sound. The men tried to dig foxholes, clawing at the earth, as if by sheer force of will they could break through the frost. Sparks flew when steel struck stone, and hands blistered inside frozen gloves. Each blow of the tool sent pain shooting through arms already numb from cold. Yet they kept at it, because to stop meant death when morning came. Audie Murphy, now in command of what remained of Company B, watched his men with a mix of pride and sorrow. Where once there had been more than 120 soldiers, now fewer than 20 stood in the line. The others had fallen in previous battles or lay wounded far to the rear. Murphy knew that these men were all that remained between the Germans and the vulnerable flank of the division. He paced slowly along the shallow trenches, offering words of encouragement, his breath steaming in the night air. Inside he was consumed by dread, but his face remained calm, because his men needed a leader who looked unshakable. The night dragged on. The sound of picks striking the earth echoed endlessly, sharp and rhythmic, a cruel reminder that the ground refused to yield. The men worked not so much to build protection as to keep themselves moving, to ward off the deadly grip of frostbite. From time to time someone paused, leaning on a shovel, gasping for air, before forcing himself to continue. Sweat froze on their foreheads, forming a thin crust of ice. Their hands shook from exhaustion, but still they swung their tools. Around them, the forest loomed in silence. Branches sagged under heavy snow, creaking as if alive. The distant rumble of artillery rolled across the land like thunder. Somewhere in the darkness, the Germans were preparing their own positions, waiting for dawn, waiting to strike. Every man of Company B felt the weight of that knowledge pressing down on him. Murphy later recalled that the night felt longer than any he had lived before. The snow was colder than he had ever imagined. The sound of picks against frozen stone hammered against his ears, relentless and maddening. 18 men left in the company worked like possessed souls, breaking their bodies against the ground, and the only benefit was that the labor kept them from freezing solid. Whenever one man stopped to catch his breath, he had to walk in circles to keep his feet from going numb. Some tried to joke in low voices, talking of home, of warm kitchen, of mothers and sweethearts waiting far away. But the words fell flat in the frozen air. Each man carried the silent understanding that many of them would not live to see those homes again. Hope was thin, but duty was heavy. As the night deepened, the men grew quieter. Only the scraping of tools and the occasional cough broke the stillness. Murphy crouched in a shallow ditch, his eyes scanning the dark horizon. He expected the Germans to come at any moment, to sweep through the trees with machine guns and grenades. His heart pounded with each gust of wind, but no attack came. The enemy was waiting too, perhaps saving their fury for the light of dawn. At one point, a flare arced across the sky in the distance, casting a pale green glow over the snow. For a heartbeat, the forest was illuminated, and the men froze, their shadows stretching long across the white ground. Then the flare faded, and darkness swallowed them again. The silence that followed was more terrible than any noise. Murphy thought of Texas, of warm fields under the sun, of the sound of cattle in the distance, of evenings spent under a sky filled with stars. He wondered if he would ever see such nights again, yet he pushed the thoughts aside. There was no place for longing now. Only the present mattered, and the present was a frozen hell where 18 men tried to hold a line against an enemy that numbered in the hundreds. Hours crawled by. The men's bodies ached with fatigue, their faces pale in the dim starlight. They had eaten little, and their stomachs growled with hunger. Canteens froze solid, and water had to be thawed with breath before it could be drunk. Frost clung to eyebrows and lashes, turning them into white masks. Still, they held on, because surrender was not an option. By the time the first gray light of morning touched the horizon, Company B had created nothing more than shallow scratches in the ground, no real trenches, no strong positions, only shallow depressions that might give the illusion of safety. Yet, to the men who had swung their tools through the endless night, those scratches felt like lifelines. They threw themselves into them, clutching rifles, waiting for what the day would bring. The forest was quiet again, too quiet. Snow drifted softly from the branches, settling over helmets and shoulders. The men of Company B huddled in their shallow foxholes, their breath rising in clouds, their eyes fixed on the dark tree line ahead. They knew that the next attack could come at any moment, and they knew that their thin defenses would be tested in ways no human being should endure. Dear listeners, this was the night that forged the spirit of Company B, a night of cold, exhaustion, and despair, where men fought not against an enemy of flesh and blood, but against the merciless elements themselves. In the next chapter, we will see how dawn revealed not hope, but the terrible storm of steel and fire that was destined to break upon them. Dawn was always the most dangerous hour for soldiers in the field. Darkness provided cover, allowed men to hide in shadows, to cling to the safety of night. But dawn stripped everything bare. The first pale light revealed the broken trees, the shallow foxholes, the trembling figures clutching rifles. It revealed every weakness, every unprepared position, every man who could be billed seen and targeted. For the soldiers of Company B, dawn was not a promise of warmth or safety. It was the signal of an attack they were certain would come. The night had been endless. Men swung their picks and shovels into frozen ground until their arms refused to lift again. They had collapsed into shallow depressions that were hardly worthy to be called trenches. Their faces were pale and drawn, their lips cracked from the biting cold. They had not slept, not truly, only drifted into uneasy half-consciousness between shivers. Every sound of the forest startled them awake again, and now, as the sky began to lighten in the east, their bodies tensed as one. The Germans would come. Everyone knew it. Audie Murphy stood among them, scanning the horizon. His eyes were red from fatigue, his breath clouding in the frosty air. He carried no illusions. He knew that his men were too few, too tired, too exposed. They had fewer than 20 left in the line, while the enemy across the fields numbered in the hundreds. He had already ordered them to prepare for the inevitable. Rifles were checked, ammunition counted, grenades kept close at hand, yet all preparation felt small compared to the wave that was about to strike. The first light of morning revealed the village of Holtzwihr in the distance. Smoke still rose from chimneys and shattered buildings. The outlines of houses stood dark against the snow. Somewhere beyond those walls, German tanks waited, their engines silent for now. The men of Company B imagined them crouched like beasts, ready to roar forward as soon as the order came. The silence before battle was worse than any gunfire. For long minutes, nothing moved. The soldiers pressed themselves into their shallow foxholes, gripping their rifles until their knuckles turned white. They expected to hear the grinding of tracks, the thunder of artillery, the shrill whistles that signaled a charge, but only the soft whisper of falling snow filled the air. It was a cruel waiting game, and nerves began to fray. Every cough seemed too loud, every shift of boots too obvious. Fear hung over the line like a heavy curtain. Then, just as despair began to creep in, a new sound rose behind them. At first it was only a distant rumble, then it grew louder, sharper, until it became unmistakable. Engines, American engines, approaching from the rear. The men lifted their heads cautiously, unsure if hope was deceiving them. Out of the trees came 2 tank destroyers, M10 Wolverines, their long barrels glistening with frost, their tracks churning the snow. The sight lifted spirits instantly. For a moment, men forgot their hunger and their exhaustion. They watched as the heavy machines rolled into position, one taking a place along the road, the other settling at a vantage point near the tree line. Their engines growled like guardians awakening from slumber. The Wolverines had arrived just in time. Murphy felt the weight on his chest ease slightly. He walked to the nearest machine, nodding to the crew as they adjusted their positions. He knew that even 2 tank destroyers could make the difference between survival and annihilation. The long barrels of their 90mm guns pointed toward the village, ready to meet any German armor that dared to advance. Their crews, bundled in heavy coats, checked ammunition belts and tested machine guns mounted on the turrets. The arrival of those machines was not only practical, it was symbolic. It told the men of Company B that they were not entirely abandoned. The soldiers watched silently as the crews coordinated with Murphy. Field telephones were checked, signals confirmed. The entire company now felt a flicker of confidence. Perhaps they could hold, perhaps they could last, until reinforcements came. It was a fragile hope, but hope nonetheless. Still, the threat of dawn remained. The Germans were out there, hidden by snow and smoke, waiting for their moment. The Americans had seen too many battles not to know the pattern. Silence would stretch until nerves frayed. Then, suddenly, the storm would break. Shells would land. Tanks would appear. Infantry in white camouflage would pour across the fields. The question was not if the attack would come, but when. The men huddled deeper into their foxholes, pulling collars up around their necks, trying to conserve warmth. Some closed their eyes for a heartbeat, whispering prayers. Others stared at the horizon without blinking, convinced that if they looked away even for a second, the enemy would appear. The forest around them remained still, but the stillness was deceptive, like the pause of breath before a scream. Murphy crouched in a drainage ditch that served as his command post. He held the field telephone close, the line stretching back to battalion headquarters a mile behind. His fingers were stiff, but he kept the receiver ready. He knew he would need to call artillery when the moment arrived. He listened to the silence of the line, hearing only the faint hum that meant the connection was alive. It was a thin lifeline to the rest of the army, and he guarded it carefully. Time moved slowly. The pale sun climbed reluctantly into the sky, hidden behind layers of cloud. Light spread across the fields, revealing the broken remains of the previous day's battle. Blackened wrecks of American equipment lay half buried in snow, grim reminders of what had happened to the 30th Regiment. The men of Company B looked upon those shapes with grim faces. They knew they might soon join them. And yet, against all odds, the attack did not come with the rising of the sun. The Germans held their fire, as if savoring the suspense, or perhaps adjusting their plans. The quiet stretched on, and in that quiet the men's fear grew sharper. It was like waiting for an avalanche that refused to fall, knowing that at any moment it would crash down with unstoppable force. For now, Company B remained in their shallow defenses, hearts pounding, nerves frayed, clinging to the fragile reassurance that came with the 2 tank destroyers. They were not strong, they were not safe, but they were not alone, and sometimes, in war, that small difference could mean everything. Dear listeners, the morning of January the 26th brought not an immediate storm, but the dreadful calm before it. Company B waited, frozen in both body and spirit, watching the horizon for the enemy that would soon descend upon them. In the next chapter, the silence will finally shatter, and the German counterattack will fall like a hammer upon the exhausted line. The afternoon of January the 26th arrived with a sense of inevitability. For hours, Company B had crouched in their shallow foxholes, nerves stretched to breaking, every man convinced that each passing moment might bring the attack. The silence of the morning had not been mercy. It had been preparation, a pause before the storm. When the storm finally came, it broke with sudden fury. The first sign was the dull thump of artillery far in the distance, followed by the shriek of incoming shells. Explosions ripped across the American line, hurling snow, earth, and fragments of steel high into the air. Trees splintered, branches fell like spears, and the frozen ground trembled as though struck by an earthquake. The men of Company B pressed themselves flat, covering their heads, waiting for the barrage to pass. The air filled with the acrid stench of smoke and the choking dust of shattered earth. The bombardment was not meant to destroy them completely. It was meant to soften them, to stun them, to prepare the way for what was coming. And then came the sound that froze their blood, the grinding roar of engines, deep and relentless, growing louder with every second. The ground itself seemed to shake. Out of the haze of smoke and drifting snow emerged the hulking shapes of German tanks. 6 of them, massive and dark, rolled forward in formation, their guns pointed directly at the American positions. The sight of them was overwhelming. Against those steel giants, rifles and carbines were like toys. Behind the tanks advanced a sea of white. 250 German infantrymen moved across the snowy fields, their camouflage smocks blending with the landscape so perfectly that they seemed to rise out of the ground itself. Only the glint of rifles and the dark slits of helmets gave them shape. They moved steadily, methodically, confident in their strength. To the men of Company B, it was like watching an avalanche descend, unstoppable and merciless. The tank destroyers that had arrived in the morning now roared to life. Their crews swung the long 90-millimeter barrels toward the advancing armor and fired. The shells streaked across the field and struck the lead tank with a resounding clang. But when the smoke cleared, the monster still moved forward, its armor unbroken. Shot after shot rang out, but the shells bounced harmlessly from the thick German plates. The Wolverines were powerful machines, but they had met opponents too strong for their weapons. The enemy answered with fire of their own. One tank traversed its turret and let loose a shell that slammed into the American line, tearing men apart and leaving a crater filled with smoke. Another tank spotted the position of a machine gun crew and obliterated it with a single blast. Flames rose from shattered positions, and the cries of the wounded filled the air. Then disaster struck the American armor. A German 88-millimeter gun found its mark and struck one of the tank destroyers squarely in the rear. The shell pierced through the thin armor, igniting the interior. The crew screamed as flames engulfed them. 2 men tumbled from the hatch, their clothing on fire, and rolled desperately in the snow. The others never escaped. The burning wreck became a beacon of despair on the battlefield. The second Wolverine fought valiantly, its crew firing both the main gun and mounted machine guns in rapid succession. Sergeant Joseph Tardif and Corporal Robert Hines sprayed the approaching infantry with streams of bullets, cutting down lines of white-clad soldiers. But in the chaos, the machine lost traction, sliding off the road into a drainage ditch. Its barrel was forced to a useless angle, unable to target the tanks. Trapped and vulnerable, the crew abandoned it and scrambled back into the forest. Now, Company B was alone once more, faced with 6 advancing tanks and 250,000 infantry. The line was thin, barely more than 18 men stretched across the frozen ground. Audie Murphy shouted orders, trying to keep them focused, trying to maintain some semblance of defense. Rifles cracked, grenades were hurled, and mortar teams fired what little ammunition remained. But it was like throwing pebbles at a flood. The German panzers kept rolling forward, crushing trees beneath their tracks, their turrets spitting fire. Each shot tore open the American defenses further. The infantry followed close behind, spreading out, firing from the hip, their shouts carrying across the snow. For the men in the foxholes, it was as if the entire world had turned into a wall of steel and gunfire, bearing down on them without mercy. Murphy realized the truth. His men could not hold. To remain meant annihilation, the complete destruction of Company B. And so he made the most painful decision a commander can make. He ordered his soldiers to fall back into the forest, to seek shelter among the trees, to save themselves for another fight. Some resisted, desperate to stand by their commander, but he forced them away. He would remain. He would hold as long as he could, alone if necessary, to give them the chance to live. The retreat was chaotic. Men stumbled through snow, carrying the wounded, glancing back at the sight of their commander, standing firm as tanks rolled closer. The forest swallowed them, leaving Murphy behind with only his field telephone and his rifle. The artillery line was still connected, and his voice carried through the crackle of static as he called down fire on the enemy. Shells began to fall among the advancing Germans, tearing gaps in their formation. But still they came, relentless, tireless, like a tide that could not be turned. The moment had come that would define not only a battle, but a legend, one man against a company of enemies, standing in the ruins of a shattered defense, refusing to yield. The German counterattack had begun, and the world seemed to hold its breath to see how long he could last. Dear listeners, the storm had broken upon Company B. 6 tanks and 250 infantry had descended upon fewer than 20 men. In the next chapter, we will witness the desperate stand of Audie Murphy as he remains to face the onslaught alone, armed with nothing but his will and his determination to hold the line. The German attack did not begin with a cautious probe. It began with fire, steel, and thunder. The first shells screamed in from hidden artillery positions beyond the village of Holtzwihr, their flight cutting the cold air with a shriek that pierced the soul before the explosion even struck. The ground shook violently, and bursts of snow erupted like geysers as the shells tore into the American line. Splintered branches rained down from the forest canopy. Men pressed themselves flat against the frozen earth, ears ringing, eyes stinging with smoke. The bombardment was relentless, a storm of steel, designed not merely to kill, but to terrify. In the midst of that bombardment, communication became chaos. Field telephones crackled with static. Voices from battalion headquarters struggled to make themselves heard, their words swallowed by the roar of shells and the thunder of falling trees. Murphy crouched in his shallow ditch, one hand clutching the receiver, the other pressed against his helmet, as though it could shield him from the weight of destruction. He shouted coordinates into the mouthpiece, adjusting artillery fire with the precision of a man who knew that each correction meant life or death for his scattered soldiers. When the barrage finally shifted forward, rolling like a curtain of flame across the snow, the true assault revealed itself. Out of the haze appeared the hulking forms of 6 German tanks, their turrets slowly rotating, their guns already hunting targets. The sight was nightmarish. They seemed to grow larger with every step forward, monstrous silhouettes emerging from the smoke like iron beasts. Snow clung to their sides, their engines growled with mechanical fury, and the tracks chewed through the frozen soil as though devouring the land itself. Behind the tanks came the infantry. 250 men moved in disciplined waves, each clothed in white camouflage that blurred their outlines against the snow. Only the rhythmic movement of their rifles and the dark holes of their faces broke the illusion of ghosts gliding across the fields. The infantry advanced with calm confidence, shielded by the tanks that rolled before them as if certain of victory. At that moment, the American tank destroyers fired. The crews of the Wolverines swung their 90-millimeter guns onto the advancing armor and pulled the triggers. The blasts were deafening, shaking the ground as shells streaked across the frozen distance. The first projectile slammed into the frontal armor of a German tank with a tremendous clang. Smoke and sparks erupted, but when the haze lifted, the tank still rolled forward. The shell had ricocheted harmlessly, leaving only a scar on the thick plate. Again and again the destroyers fired, their barrels glowing, their crews working with desperate speed. Each time the shells found their mark, each time the tanks shuddered under the impact, but each time the armor held. The men who had prayed for salvation from those guns now stared in disbelief. The weapons designed to halt armor could not stop these monsters. What was supposed to be their shield had turned into a feeble protest against inevitability. The German answer came quickly. One tank fired a direct shot at the lead Wolverine. The 88-millimeter shell roared across the field and struck the rear of the American vehicle. There was a blinding flash. Then fire erupted from the hatches as ammunition inside ignited. The crew had no chance. Flames consumed them instantly, and the burning wreck became a beacon of horror. Black smoke rose into the pale sky, marking the death of American armor. The second Wolverine fought on. Its machine guns blazed furiously, cutting down German infantry who had strayed too close. Bullets tore into the white-clad soldiers, leaving dark stains on the snow. For a moment it seemed as if the crew might yet make a difference, if not with their cannon, then with sheer ferocity. Sergeant Joseph Tardif and Corporal Robert Hines manned the weapons, their faces grim, their hands blistered from the heat of the guns. They shouted orders to each other over the roar of engines and the staccato hammer of machine fire. But fate was cruel. In their attempt to reposition, the Wolverine slid from the road into a drainage ditch. Its tracks spun helplessly, throwing up snow and mud but finding no purchase. The barrel of its main gun lowered at an awkward angle, unable to target the advancing tanks. In that instant, the great machine was reduced to nothing more than a trapped hulk, vulnerable and impotent. The crew realized their peril. They abandoned the vehicle under fire, leaping from the hatch, scrambling into the cover of the trees. The collapse of the tank destroyers was devastating for morale. Soldiers who had clung to the hope of armor support now found themselves stripped bare once again. The German tanks pressed forward without hesitation, their turrets swinging toward the foxholes where men of Company B still clung to survival. Shells tore through the line, explosions hurling snow and bodies alike into the air. The cries of the wounded mingled with the grinding thunder of engines and the rattle of machine gun fire. Audie Murphy watched all of this unfold from his shallow ditch. His heart pounded with fury and desperation, yet his mind remained clear. He knew that without the destroyers, his men were defenseless against the tanks. Rifles could not pierce armor. Grenades were too short-ranged to matter. His only remaining weapon was the artillery he directed by telephone. He clutched the receiver and shouted more coordinates, bringing down fire dangerously close to his own position. Shells whistled overhead and slammed into the advancing Germans, scattering infantry and forcing some tanks to maneuver. The battlefield became a nightmare of smoke and fire. Snow turned black with soot, red with blood. Trees burned where shells had struck. The forest echoed with gunfire, the steady beat of machine guns, the thunder of tank cannons, and the steady crash of artillery. Every sense was overwhelmed. The air stank of burning oil and cordite. The ground shook beneath each explosion. Men screamed for medics who could not reach them. Others lay silent, their faces already pale in death. Through it all, Murphy remained at the center. He held the line of communication with battalion, called for fire, and fired his own carbine until the last magazine was gone. Around him, the remnants of Company B clung to the edges of survival, each man fighting not for victory, but simply to live through another minute. The first strikes of German artillery had broken their defenses, and the destruction of the tank destroyers had robbed them of their shield. What remained was chaos, raw and merciless, the crucible in which legends are forged. In that crucible, Audie Murphy would soon make his stand. Dear listeners, the American defense had been shattered. Their armor lay in ruins, their men scattered and bleeding. Yet one man refused to yield. In the next chapter, we will see how Audie Murphy, alone on the field of fire and chaos, chose to stand where no one else could, turning disaster into defiance. The battlefield was collapsing into ruin. Smoke choked the frozen air. Flames rose from shattered trees and wrecked machines, and the steady roar of German tanks shook the ground with each turn of their treads. Company B had fought until their arms were numb and their ammunition nearly gone. But they were too few, too exposed, too broken to withstand what pressed against them. The tank destroyers lay silent, one a burning husk, the other trapped and abandoned in a ditch. Infantry in white camouflage continued to advance across the snow, their numbers unbroken despite the shell bursts and desperate volleys from the American line. Audie Murphy looked at his men and felt the weight of command as if it were carved into his bones. Less than 20 remained, scattered across shallow foxholes, their faces gray with exhaustion, their eyes hollow with fear. They had fought for days without rest, trudged through snow, tried and failed to dig into frozen earth, and now faced annihilation. To keep them in place was to sentence them to certain death. Yet to order a retreat in the face of the enemy was to abandon ground they had sworn to hold. Murphy wrestled with the choice in the space of a few pounding heartbeats. The decision was clear. A dead company could not fight again. A lost position could be retaken with reinforcements, but men once killed were gone forever. Murphy raised his voice above the thunder of battle, shouting for them to fall back into the forest. His words cut through the smoke, sharp and undeniable. "Go," he commanded. "Get back to the trees. Save yourselves." Some hesitated. Their loyalty bound them to him, and the thought of leaving their commander alone on the field was unbearable. Private Irving Kelly glared at Murphy with a mix of fury and despair, refusing to move. Sergeant Harold Corll also lingered, gripping his rifle tightly, unwilling to yield. But Murphy's eyes were iron. He ordered them again, louder, harsher, forcing the command into their hearts. At last, with bitter reluctance, they obeyed. Kelly and Corll were among the last to turn away, their boots crunching through snow as they disappeared into the shadows of the forest. Murphy remained. He crouched in his shallow ditch, the field telephone pressed to his ear, the line still connected to battalion headquarters a mile behind. The voice of an artillery officer crackled faintly through the static, asking for coordinates, waiting for direction. Murphy provided them without hesitation, calling down shells upon the advancing German line. The explosions fell so close that fragments of rock and metal showered over his position. He was not only directing the fire, he was gambling with it, daring to bring destruction almost upon his own head if it meant slowing the enemy advance. Around him, the field was a nightmare. German infantry surged forward, crouching low as they advanced behind the tanks. Snow sprayed into the air as bullets and shells ripped across the frozen ground. Murphy's carbine was nearly empty. He fired his last rounds, each shot deliberate, each bullet buying another breath of time. When the magazine clicked empty, he tossed the weapon aside. All that remained was the telephone and his will. He looked once more toward the forest where his men had vanished. Relief mingled with loneliness in his chest. They were alive for now, because he had sent them away. But their survival meant that he must stay, alone, the last defender of a line that no longer existed. His task was not to win, but to hold, to delay, to bleed the enemy of precious minutes until reinforcements could arrive. Snow fell more heavily, clinging to his uniform, dusting the field telephone, coating the wreckage of the burning tank destroyer. Through the swirling flakes, he saw the shapes of German soldiers moving closer, their rifles glinting, their shouts carrying across the field. He gave new coordinates into the telephone, his voice steady despite the storm around him. Artillery answered with thunder, bursting among the advancing troops, tearing gaps in their ranks. Men fell screaming, yet others pressed forward relentless, as though no force could halt them. Murphy's heart pounded, yet his face remained calm. Fear gnawed at the edges of his resolve, but he smothered it beneath the weight of responsibility. This was the moment that mattered most. His men were gone, safe for now, and he alone remained between the enemy and the battalion headquarters further behind. He had chosen this role not out of recklessness, but out of necessity. One man could hold longer than many if he was willing to risk everything. The forest behind him was silent. The men of Company B watching from the shadows, unwilling to abandon him fully. They saw him standing against the storm, a solitary figure crouched beside a telephone, defying an army. Some would remember this image for the rest of their lives, the sight of their commander refusing to retreat, refusing to surrender, even as death closed in around him. For Murphy there was no thought of glory, only the cold, the smoke, the grinding of tank engines, and the crackle of the telephone in his ear. He had ordered his men away because he valued their lives above all else. Now he would fight alone, with whatever means he could find, until the very end. Dear listeners, this was the hour when Audie Murphy made the decision that turned him into a legend. He chose to stay behind, to face 6 tanks and hundreds of infantry alone, to call down artillery upon the enemy even as they closed within yards of his position. In the next chapter, we will see how this young lieutenant transformed isolation into defiance, climbing onto the burning wreck of a tank destroyer and unleashing a storm of fire upon his foes. The decision had already been made in Murphy's mind long before the moment arrived. He had ordered his men into the forest. He had exhausted his carbine ammunition, and still the enemy pressed forward in overwhelming numbers. The tanks rumbled across the snowy ground with terrifying calm, their armor deflecting shells, their guns spewing fire. Infantry in white smocks closed the distance, rifles spitting, grenades ready. The line was broken. Company B was gone. What remained was a lone officer, crouched beside a field telephone, holding destruction at bay with his voice. Then Murphy's eyes fixed upon the burning wreck of the abandoned tank destroyer. Flames licked from its shattered rear, black smoke spiraled into the sky, and the smell of burning fuel filled the air. It was a grave for the men who had once crewed it, a shattered machine destined to explode at any moment. Yet atop its turret sat a weapon, silent and waiting, the heavy 50 caliber machine gun that had not yet spoken. In that instant, Murphy understood. If the line was to hold, if even one more minute could be stolen from the enemy, it would be with that gun. The decision was madness. Any sane soldier would have avoided the wreck, knowing that heat and fire would soon ignite the ammunition within, tearing the machine apart in a violent blast. But sanity had no place on that field. Murphy sprinted through snow and mud, bullets snapping past him, explosions showering him with dirt and steel. He reached the burning hulk, grabbed the edge of the turret, and hauled himself upward. Heat seared his hands, smoke blinded his eyes, but he did not stop. He clambered onto the wreck, braced his body against the turret, and seized the grips of the machine gun. The weapon roared to life with a sound that drowned even the tanks. The heavy thumping of the .50 caliber echoed through the forest, a rhythm of defiance that shook friend and foe alike. Long streams of fire tore across the snowy field, stitching death into the ranks of the advancing infantry. German soldiers fell in rows, their white smocks torn open by the massive rounds. The weapon rattled Murphy's bones with each burst, the recoil slamming through his shoulders, but he held fast, feeding the enemy a storm of steel. The German tanks halted, their infantry scattering in confusion. They had expected the line to collapse completely once the tank destroyers fell. They had not expected one man to climb upon a burning wreck and unleash fury with a gun designed to kill aircraft. Bullets the size of a man's thumb ripped into their ranks, cutting down officers, breaking formations, driving men to ground. The snow that had been pure white only hours before was now stained dark with blood and churned black by explosions. Murphy's field of vision narrowed into a tunnel of fire and smoke. He could no longer feel the cold. The heat of the burning machine beneath him wrapped his body. The barrel of the gun glowed red, and sparks danced around him. At times, smoke enveloped him completely, and it seemed impossible that he still lived. Yet, when the haze cleared, the gun was still hammering, his hands were still steady, and the enemy was still falling. Infantry tried to flank him, creeping along ditches and ridges, hoping to strike from the side. Murphy swept the gun in wide arcs, cutting them down before they could rise to throw grenades. At one point, he spotted a cluster of Germans crouching in a drainage ditch only yards away. He turned the barrel slowly, pressed the trigger, and watched them collapse in heaps as the bullets tore through. German artillery joined the attempt to silence him. Shells burst all around, showering the wreck with fragments, shaking the ground so violently that Murphy nearly lost his balance. Twice enemy 88-millimeter rounds struck the wreck itself, blasting steel apart, wrapping him in a shroud of fire and smoke. Each time he expected the world to end, for the machine beneath him to explode and consume him in flame. But each time he emerged coughing, burned but alive, and the gun roared again. From the forest behind, the men of Company B watched with awe. They had retreated only because he had ordered it, and now they stood in silent witness to his defiance. They saw him silhouetted against fire and smoke, a solitary figure atop a burning machine, pouring bullets into the enemy as though possessed. Some wept openly, certain they were watching the last moments of their commander's life. Others clenched their rifles, desperate to return, yet knowing they would only add their bodies to the slaughter. The German tanks, unable to spot his exact position through the smoke and chaos, hesitated. Without infantry to support them, they dared not press too close. Murphy understood this instinctively. He focused his fire upon the soldiers rather than the machines, knowing that tanks without infantry were vulnerable and incomplete. Round after round tore into the white-clad figures, breaking their resolve, forcing them to huddle behind wreckage or retreat across the open field. His hands blistered from the heat of the grips. His body trembled from exhaustion. Blood seeped from an old wound reopened by the violence of the fight. Yet still he fought on. He paused only to call new coordinates into the telephone, directing artillery closer and closer until shells burst almost at his feet. He joked later that he had decided he could survive the blasts if the Germans could not. But in the moment, it was no jest. It was necessity. He brought down the storm upon himself, gambling his life with every correction. Minutes stretched into eternity. The wreck beneath him groaned, flames rising higher, the metal glowing from heat. At any moment, the fuel and remaining shells inside could ignite. Murphy knew this, but he did not climb down. To leave the gun was to surrender the field, and that he refused to do. He continued firing until belts of ammunition ran dry, then slammed fresh ones into place with trembling fingers, each movement mechanical, practiced, unstoppable. At last, the German attack faltered. The infantry, mauled and scattered, began to fall back toward Holtzwihr. The tanks, stripped of their support, reversed slowly, unwilling to push into the storm of artillery and machine gun fire that one man had conjured. Smoke still drifted across the snow. The air still shook with distant explosions. But the immediate threat had been broken. One officer, alone atop a burning tank destroyer, had forced an entire company of enemy soldiers to retreat. Murphy staggered down from the wreck at last, his uniform scorched, his face smeared with soot, his body trembling with exhaustion. Blood darkened his trousers where an old wound had torn open again. His boots slipped in the snow as he limped toward the forest. Behind him, the tank destroyer finally erupted in a violent explosion, flames shooting skyward, the turret blown apart. Had he remained only moments longer, he would have been consumed, but fate had spared him long enough to carve his name into legend. Dear listeners, the burning tank destroyer became the stage for one of the most extraordinary acts of defiance in the war. Alone with a .50 caliber machine gun, Audie Murphy held back tanks and hundreds of infantry, buying the time his men needed to survive. In the next chapter, we will see how, after descending from the wreck, he rallied what remained of Company B and led them into a counterattack that reclaimed the field. The battle at Holtzwihr ended not with victory in the conventional sense, but with survival against impossible odds. The German assault had been broken, their infantry scattered, their tanks forced to withdraw. When reinforcements finally arrived, they found the field littered with bodies, craters, and burned machines. At the center of it all was a young officer, scorched, wounded, and staggering from exhaustion, yet still alive. Audie Murphy had held a line that should have been erased, and in doing so, he had written his name into the history of his nation. In the days that followed, the men of Company B could scarcely believe what they had witnessed. Each soldier who had survived carried the image of Murphy upon the burning tank destroyer etched into memory. They told the story in hushed voices, not out of embellishment, but out of awe. It spread quickly beyond the regiment, through the division, and soon across the army. Reports reached higher command, and the magnitude of his actions could not be denied. On the 2nd day of June in the year 1945, Lieutenant General Alexander Patch, commander of the 7th Army, awarded Audie Murphy the Medal of Honor. The official citation described how For 1 full hour he had directed artillery, killed and wounded approximately 50 enemy soldiers, and refused to yield ground despite wounds and exhaustion. It declared that his courage had saved his company from destruction and preserved the position that was vital for the advance. The Medal of Honor, the highest recognition his nation could bestow, was placed upon his chest. The medal was not the only honor. By the end of the war, Murphy had received every decoration for valor his country offered. 2 Silver Stars, the Distinguished Service Cross, 2 Bronze Stars, 3 Purple Hearts, the Legion of Merit, and finally, the Medal of Honor. No other soldier of his generation carried so many awards for bravery. He became known as the most decorated American soldier of the Second World War. Yet for Murphy, the weight of medals was not light. Behind each ribbon lay memories of comrades lost, nights of terror, wounds that throbbed in silence. He was only 20 years old when the war ended, yet his eyes carried decades of experience. The nation celebrated him as a hero, but he himself often felt only the burden of what he had endured. When the war was over, Murphy returned briefly to Texas. He might have faded quietly into civilian life, but fate pulled him toward a different stage. In September of 1945, actor James Cagney saw his photograph on the cover of Life magazine and invited him to Hollywood. The young veteran accepted, unsure of what the future might hold. There he discovered a new career, not as a soldier, but as an actor. Hollywood embraced him. He appeared in more than 40 films, many of them westerns where his quiet demeanor and sharp features suited the role of a lone gunfighter. In 1955, he played himself in the film To Hell and Back, based upon his wartime memoir. Audiences filled theaters to watch the real man relive the battles that had made him famous. The film became a success, cementing his place as both war hero and movie star. Yet behind the screen, Murphy carried scars invisible to the public. Nights brought him little rest. He woke drenched in sweat, heart pounding with memories of artillery and fire. What would later be called post-traumatic stress disorder haunted him daily. He suffered from insomnia, depression, and a temper sharpened by flashbacks. For years, he slept with a pistol under his pillow, convinced that enemies might still be near. Though admired by millions, he struggled privately with the shadows of his past. Despite the torment, he used his fame to advocate for soldiers who faced the same unseen wounds. He spoke openly of his struggles, insisting that the nation owed care and compassion to its veterans. At a time when few dared to discuss such matters, he gave voice to thousands who remained silent. In this way, his courage extended beyond the battlefield into the quiet battles of peace. But life remained difficult. Financial troubles weighed heavily. Film roles grew fewer as years passed, and Murphy invested poorly, often trusting the wrong people. The man who had faced tanks without fear now faced creditors with the same grim endurance. He worked where he could, still appearing on screen, still carrying the aura of the lone hero, though inside he remained restless. Tragedy struck on the 28th of May in the year 1971. Murphy boarded a small private aircraft in the state of Virginia. The weather turned foul, the clouds thick and unforgiving, and the pilot struggled to maintain control. Near the town of Roanoke, the plane crashed into Brush Mountain. All 5 aboard perished instantly. Audie Murphy, the boy from Texas who had become the most decorated soldier of his generation, the reluctant hero who turned into a Hollywood star, was dead at only 46 years of age. The nation mourned. Veterans wept openly. Civilians left flowers at theaters where his films had once played. The memory of Holtzwihr returned to every telling of his life. They remembered the lone figure upon the burning tank destroyer, the young man who had refused to surrender, the soldier who carried more medals than any other, yet still insisted he had only done his duty. He was buried with full honors at Arlington National Cemetery, his grave one of the most visited among the thousands that stretch across that hallowed ground. The legacy of Audie Murphy endures not only in medals or films, but in the story of courage born in the darkest hour. He was a soldier, an actor, a man haunted by ghosts, yet also a man who spoke for those who suffered silently. His life was brief, but it was filled with meaning that outlasts the years. Dear listeners, thus ends the story of Holtzwihr and of Audie Murphy. From a frozen January battlefield to the hills of Hollywood, from glory to tragedy, his life remains a reminder that even one man standing alone can change the course of history.